Is there a message of necessity at the desk? There is a message of necessity at the desk. Move to accept the message of necessity. The message is accepted.
Welcome to Messages of Necessity, a podcast of the Empire Center for Public Policy. I am Cam Macdonald. I'm an adjunct fellow at the Empire Center and the executive director of the Government Justice Center. I'm here today with Ken Girardin. He's the research director at the Empire Center. And Ken, there's been a pretty big story happening under the radar with respect to public employee pensions that you brought to light last week in a written piece. And I'm just wondering if you could just start off here today by telling us uh, some background on how pensions work in New York's public sector.
New York public employers, that's state agencies, local governments, and school districts, offer taxpayer guaranteed, state income tax exempt, defined benefit pensions that give employees a guaranteed payment in retirement based primarily on how long they worked and what they were earning in the last few years before retirement.
So I've been in the private sector all my life, and I've had 401ks that I've taken with me and converted into IRAs when I've changed jobs and contributed to my own 401k and had some sort of employer match. And it seems to me that that's the predominant form of retirement savings in the private sector. What's the distinction with New York here and public sector employees in New York?
Well, for one thing, you're reminding me that we need to have an entire podcast just about your employment history because it's probably the most interesting employment history of anyone who's involved with the Empire Center. But all right, sorry, we'll set that teaser aside. Defined benefit pensions are extremely rare. They are accessible only to 15% of private sector employees. It's an even smaller percentage of employees when you look at firms with fewer than 100 or fewer than 50 people. It's something that's really disappeared because as people have been living longer and as it's been harder to sock away enough money to really weather the turbulence in financial markets, employers have realized it's more predictable, and employees have realized it's more, frankly, it's more reliable to have that money in hand in people's, individual defined contribution 401k style accounts. So New York is increasingly an outlier in terms of how it's financing retirements compared to the way that the residents in the private sector are having their retirements financed.
Okay, so now in the news has been New York public sector employee unions saying that New York needs to fix Tier 6. What on earth is Tier 6 and why does it exist?
So, like I was saying, the pensions are decided primarily based on, how long people worked and what they were making before retirement. The exact rules are a function of when you were hired in New York. And the reason is that over time, the state has periodically realized that as people are living longer, and as conditions have changed in financial markets, it's been unsustainable to keep them in their current form. The last round, the last round of this was in 2010, and then again in 2012, where pension contribution costs had increased almost tenfold in the decade before. The state and local governments together were contributing less than $1 billion into pension funds in 2000. By 2010, the annual bill was almost $10 billion. So there was a recognition that they needed to make some major changes. For one thing, they needed public employees to pay toward their pensions for their entire careers. Between 2000 and 2010, public employees who'd been on the job for at least 10 years stopped paying into their pensions. They stopped paying in entirely. Up until that point, up until 2010, employees also had the ability to retire with a full pension after age 55. which is something that's almost science fiction in most parts of the private sector. So the state did these 2 rounds of pension reforms, meaning anybody hired after those dates was put in either tier 5 or after 2012 into tier 6. Now, flash forward 12 years later, the bulk of public employees are in tier 6. And the unions are pushing to retroactively change the rules for how their pensions will be calculated. And what we're seeing is this really I don't know what adjective to use. I'm trying to be charitable here, but we'll say bogus claim that the state of New York is having a recruitment and retention crisis. This is a quote used by a supportive state lawmaker, a recruitment and retention crisis, because the pension changes made in 2012 did things such as requiring state workers to work until age 63 to get a full pension. Now, again, the taxpayer guaranteed state tax exempt pension is not something that's available to anyone else in the private sector. The state of New York still has the platinum, the gold standard, if not platinum standard, for employee benefits. And anyone will recognize this by talking to literally anyone in the private sector and doing a quick comparison there. But the unions are claiming that since 2012, the state of New York has had a recruitment problem because the pension benefits aren't as generous as they were before. So, like I was saying, they aren't the way they were before because the state couldn't afford to keep paying for the types of benefits they had before. The combination of turbulence in financial markets and the fact that people were living longer made that approach unsustainable. And by the way, even after they had reformed the pension benefits in 2010 and again in 2012, the pension costs didn't stop climbing. They didn't peak until 2015, when they were up in the neighborhood of something like $16 billion per year, up from below $1 billion just 15 years before. So the state made these changes in 2010 and 2012, and those changes together shaved about $100 billion off of the state's future pension costs over between then and 2040. If the unions are successful in rolling back meaningful parts of the tier 5 and tier 6 pension reforms, you're going to be looking at slamming state taxpayers and local property taxpayers with billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars in unnecessary additional pension costs in the next few years.
And why this is a critical issue now, getting into my legal world, is the fact that anything that's done is to change these benefits will be permanent, correct?
Correct. It can't be undone. So we can fight every year about how big school aid is or how much the state's going to spend on Medicaid, and know that if things go particularly bonkers in one year, they can be reversed in the next year. That's not the case with pensions. All it takes is for the governor and the legislature to give things away once, and you will be paying these things. I mean, without exaggeration, you'll be paying for the rest of the century in some cases with stuff, because anyone who's on the job, anyone who's been on the job one day when these changes take effect, they will still be subject, they will still be eligible for these more generous and likely unsustainable benefit levels for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and just to clarify, that's because the New York State Constitution contains a provision that guarantees that public sector employee pension benefits cannot be reduced. So I'm thinking then that's probably why you had some pretty harsh words for Senate Republicans last week.
So the Senate Republicans on Thursday tried to bring a tier 6 related bill to the floor. They were unsuccessful, but they voted as a block to try to bring up this bill for debate that would have made a comparatively minor change to how pensions are calculated, but they would have really open the door to much more costly changes. Their bill only would have cost state and local taxpayers about $4 billion. So it's a rounding error, Cam, right? Their bill would have the bill they wanted to force a vote on would have changed the how pensions are calculated, basically from the 5 final years of most employees' work to 3 years. And that would have the effect of bumping up, say like a typical, bumping up a teacher's pension, like ballpark $1,000, depending on where they were in the state. For downstate police officers, it would have been more. But the Senate Republicans, for all their complaining about taxes and debt and spending and unfunded mandates, they were the ones trying to, force, to force taxpayers who haven't even been born yet to bear billions of dollars in unnecessary pension costs. And that's something that the public needs to be made aware of.
Um, the well, what's the reason? Have there been any good reasons given for wanting to make that change in that calculation? The 3 versus 5. I know you talked about a recruitment problem. Is there really any sort of solid reason why these changes should be made?
I would take a mediocre reason at this point. No one has been able to present any evidence for changing the pension system, except for the fact that the unions are asking for it. So the unions have been claiming that there are problems with recruitment and retention caused by the pension. Some state lawmakers have been saying that the pension is the biggest obstacle to recruitment and retention, which is absolutely bogus. So there is all sorts of upheaval happening in in both the public and private sector since COVID. You went from the a fairly strong, healthy economy in 2019 to the economy literally being put on pause in early 2020. You've had this great reshuffling of folks. You had a lot of people leaving the workforce. You had a lot of people moving around the country. We've had all sorts of upheaval. So to suggest that the state of New York is having hiring struggles specifically due to a pension policy change 12 years ago, and that and that those problems are larger than the ones driven by the pandemic that the entire rest of the workforce is dealing with is just preposterous. No one has been able to present any evidence that the pension system is a problem. There are lots of obstacles to hiring in New York. One of them is the fact that New York State is competing with a very, with basically a supersized healthcare sector that's the result of the state piping more money into the Medicaid program than it should be. That's one thing. You have the fact that the state has really complicated civil service rules that present a problem for drawing out the hiring process, where people will get offered jobs working for state or local government, and by the time the state or local government can actually get that offer in people's hands, they've taken jobs elsewhere in the private sector. The state is still offering Cadillac benefits. Local governments are still offering Cadillac benefits, um, and frankly, people, normal folks, job applicants, don't understand the ins and outs of how the pension works. They know there is a pension, and that's about the limit of most people's knowledge. So to suggest that people know the particulars and the differences between tier 4 and tier 5 and tier 6, and that tier 5 and 6 not being as generous as tier 4 is somehow hobbling the state's hiring powers is completely ludicrous. And and taxpayers should be outraged that their elected officials are using this fig leaf to this intellectually dishonest argument to try to cover up a naked giveaway to the public employee unions in an election year, by the way.
So, and this is just my, this might not even have a whole lot of basis in fact, but it's my opinion, so I'm going to share it with everyone, is that the pensions seem to be, to me, to be actually an archaic concept for today's modern workforce, because all you hear about is the fact that people job hop, that people younger than me or even you don't want to be in one place for more than a few years at a time, and want to move around. And so the pensions, it would seem to me, would be actually a detriment to hiring the next generations.
They would, and you're hitting on a couple funny things there. In as much as the unions have been saying that these pensions are a threat to the state's retention abilities, if you're trying to give people full retirement at age 55, and the retirement age right now is 63, and you make that change, you're going to retain fewer people, not more, because you're going to be literally encouraging people to leave at 55 rather than staying on till they're 63. So there's that. There's also the fact that in 2012, the state really leaned into this idea of giving people a more modern, portable retirement option. A lot of folks don't know this, but SUNY professors are offered the choice between a pension and a defined contribution style retirement plan, and they overwhelmingly choose the defined contribution plan. And in as much as state lawmakers have said, oh, we've got recruitment problems and we need to do more with the pension stuff for recruitment, none of them seem to want to talk about the possibility of allowing school teachers and other public employees to even have the choice to get into a defined contribution plan. So all of this together is just this real morass of dishonesty that is designed to cover up what's frankly like a good old-fashioned bank heist. That's what's in progress right now. You had the Senate Republicans, endorsing the first $4 billion of that bank heist last week. Legislative Democrats have also been on board with this separately. They've endorsed this $4 billion bit in their budget proposals, but ultimately there's $100 billion on the line here, and the question is at the heart of it is whether Governor Hochul is prepared to dig in and stand up for taxpayers and prevent this from happening.
Well, Ken, this has been
Uplifting.
I was going to say the opposite, but thank you for shedding light on this issue and for helping to explain it. I am not going to go look at my I'm not going to go now and look at my 401k or IRA amounts and put them into any sort of calculator to see what the benefit would be, because it would make me cry compared to the state pension. But that said, this has been another episode of Messages of Necessity. We thank you for listening, and please go rate us and share us wherever you get your podcasts.
For more news and analysis, visit our website and sign up for email updates at empirecenter.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Empire Center.